Call the Tuesday, September 25th, 2018 meeting of the Portsmouth City Council, which is work session, to order. And Madam Clerk, will you call the roll, please?
Yes, sir. Mr. Clark?
Here.
Mrs. Lucasberg?
Yes.
Mr. Moody?
Here.
Ms. Simmons?
Here.
Mr. Smith? Dr. Whitaker?
Present.
Mayor Rowe?
Here. Dr. Pack.
Yes, Mayor. Mayor, Vice Mayor, and members of City Council. The first presentation, Mr. Brian Sweats, Planning Administrator, will provide an update on the Joint Land Use Study. After several years of effort, the Joint Land Use Study involving the Navy, the City of Portsmouth, and the City of Chesapeake has finally begun. The purpose of the Joint Land Use Study uses land uses around the various naval installations, including Craney Island, the Navy Regional Medical Center, Portsmouth, the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, and St. Julian's Creek Annex. Also, the study will evaluate the impact of sea level rise at the various installations, including transportation routes that provide for access and mobility. The second presentation, the Atlantic Woods Superfund site, is a 48-acre Superfund site resulting from the completion of remedial activities performed by the Environmental Protection Agency, better known as EPA. Current remediation efforts for the EPA include dredging and removing contaminated sediments from the Elizabeth River adjacent to the Atlantic Woods site and stabilizing them with Portland cement prior to replacement behind a newly constructed retaining seawall. Mr. James Wright, Chief Engineer, will provide an update on the current EPA project, and City Attorney Solomon H. Ashby will lead a discussion in the jurisdiction and disposal of new land in the area. The last presentation is a zoning ordinance update. On Thursday, September the 27th, City Council and the Planning Commission will conduct a work session on the zoning ordinance rewrite project. The two topics for discussion will include zoning philosophy and zoning use table. To assist in preparation for the work session, a zoning ordinance workbook was placed in your box. Mr. Bob Baldwin will provide a brief overview of how to prepare for the upcoming zoning discussions. Mr. Sweats.
Thank you, Dr. Patton. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, Madam Vice Mayor, members of Council. Again, my name is Brian Sweats. I'm in the Planning Department. I'll be the project manager for our Joint Land Use Study. I'm here to give you a briefing on what to expect through this process. So first, what exactly is a Joint Land Use Study? Well, this is a cooperative land use plan, and the four major participants here will be ourselves, City of Portsmouth, the City of Chesapeake, the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, which will be the overall project manager, and then the Navy. The effort will have a couple of committees. One will be a technical committee, which will be made up of various staff members from the various cities, from the Navy, from the Planning District Commission and relevant agencies. And then we will have a policy committee where we are anticipating that Mr. Rowe, Dr. Patton, and Mr. Baldwin will be representing Portsmouth. We are still a little bit in flux. We're working with the City of Chesapeake to make sure that we're all balanced and we're all working towards the same goal, represented by the same basic types of people. There will also be various stakeholders who will be involved here. We'll be working with VDOT. We'll be working with our Planning Commission, you all, and City Council. We'll be working with the HRT, with the Port Authority, and other relevant agencies. The funding for this will come from the Department of Defense's Office of Economic Adjustment, and we have hired the lead consultant who will be AECOM. So why is a joint land use study necessary? Well, we're trying to achieve two major goals here. The first is to ensure that development does not impede operations on the naval facilities here in Portsmouth. And the second is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of those living and working around these facilities. In the worst case scenario, what we're trying to avoid is what you see in the news with Virginia Beach, where they have problems with their land use being next to naval facilities where planes may literally fall out of the sky on people's houses, which has happened in the past. We are trying to avoid incidents like that where what goes on a naval facility does not negatively impact what's going on in our neighborhoods and vice versa. The primary issues that we're looking at, first and foremost, is sea level rise and flooding. This is coming directly from the Navy. They want to make sure that their facilities are going to be able to be up and operational in the future. Sea level rise and flooding have a major impact on transportation here in the city, as you all know, but this is something the Navy is very worried about. They want to make sure that their employees and contractors can get to and from their facilities if there's a hazard or if there's a storm event. We're also looking at things like gate security. How do people get into the facility? Parking, the picture here on the right shows neighborhoods north of the shipyard where we know that overflow parking ends up on the street. We want to make sure that we're not negatively impacting residents. And rail operations, as railroads go into and out of naval facilities, are they stopping or Portsmouth traffic to an unnecessary degree? And finally, land use, compatibility, construction impacts, noise, dust. These are the things I just mentioned, like out at Virginia Beach, or more specifically in our area, we look at things like the industrial activity in the Burton's Point area, making sure the stuff that happens there is not messing with stuff that's happening at the shipyard. So we have 3 main naval facilities in Portsmouth that we will be looking at in this joint land use study. We have the Craney Island Fuel Terminal, we have the Naval Medical Center, and we have the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. I've also highlighted some major roads and interstates that we may be looking at. We are still finalizing which roads, but we want to make sure that these are places that do not have or are not experiencing undue traffic. They're not being flooded out during hazard and storm events. Making sure, again, that people can get to and from naval facilities if they need to. We're also highlighting Victory Boulevard, which serves as an access point to the St. Julian's Creek Annex, which is the naval facility in Chesapeake that will be part of the JLUS. We are anticipating that this project will last for 19 months, and we will have periodic updates for you along the way. During those 19 months, we'll be looking at 5 different phases of the project. The first phase is what we are now, our project initiation. We are working with AECOM, the City of Chesapeake, and with the Miles Agency to finalize our public outreach plan.
You said AECOM?
AECOM. Under phase 2, we'll be gathering information, assessing it, so we'll collect data. So this might be things like traffic counts or level of service standards or flooding and sea level rise projections. In phase 3, we'll start analyzing those to see how they'll affect our infrastructure, how they'll affect naval operations. In phase 4, we'll take what we've learned in phases 2 and 3, and we will create recommendations and strategies for addressing them. And then finally, phase 5 is our implementation phase, where we have an actual document where we describe how it is that we want to implement these recommendations and strategies and how we will go about doing that in the future. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Questions? Yes.
Can I assume that the reason the Coast Guard is not included is because the Navy is paying for it?
Actually, that's a good question. I'll defer to
Mr.
Baldwin
Baldwin
on this one.
will answer that.
Good evening, and as indicated, the study is being funded by the Department of Defense. As you know, the Coast Guard is not a Department of Defense agency, so they will be included as a stakeholder in the process, but they are not a Navy facility, and this is a Navy project primarily.
Luckily, their facilities are close by.
Yeah. But to follow up on her question, the Hampton Roads sector, which is the captain of the port, which would manage a storm event like what we were anticipating, is located on the Coast Guard base. And they're definitely in Zone A. And they would have had to evacuate and handle that event from a remote area. So I think it's really important that they be part of this process, even if we classify them as a stakeholder.
And Abs, if I just respond to that too, that's the same reason that the Port Authority is involved, same reason a lot of these other players. When we mention these stakeholders, they are active participants in the process. They're not something you sort of bring in a little bit. They are at the table as you go through the whole process. So definitely the Coast Guard. A lot of issues related to Craney Island and the Coast Guard. they share the fuel facility. Clearly puts them involved. They are also affected by the same transportation network, the same issues related to flooding. So they'll definitely be engaged in the process. We've had conversations with them, so they're not lost. But from the official setup of the process, from the Department of Defense and the Office of Economic Adjustment, it's really a Navy project, and everyone else it's between the Navy and the localities, and that's the way it's set up. Everyone else is a stakeholder.
All right. Other questions?
Yes,
Lisa?
during phase 2, the information gathering assessment, will that be on a survey, or will it be just land, field, talking to people?
It'll be all manner of information gathering. So yes, this will be where we start our public outreach efforts. So we're requesting and requiring that they go actually into the communities to meet with civic leagues and stakeholder organizations, as opposed to only holding public open houses. We want this to look more like our comp plan efforts, where we're much more active, engaged than we were passive. Then it'll also involve various agencies and bringing in whatever technical data that they may have. Again, things like traffic patterns and traffic counts. Those will be things that we can look at.
We classify VDOT as a stakeholder.
Yes.
All right. Other questions? All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wright will come forward with the Atlantic Wood update.
Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, and members of City Council. Here to give you a brief update of the EPA remediation effort at the Glanded Wood site. So this map here is just a general overview of the properties involved in that area. So here you have the PER property. Here's the AWI site. Here's the original seawall or bulkhead. This is the extended bulkhead that was just created by EPA, the area of the dredge. This is the Jordan Bridge. This is Elm Avenue, and where Elm Avenue formerly met with the Jordan Bridge. This is the alternate site, the site across where they do most of their production for AWI. They manufacture concrete beams and things such as see bridges now. The former school property that's now owned by PPIC. The Vane Brothers property. The former Vane Brothers property is now owned by PPIC. Vane Brothers down here, Acumen Marine, and Navy property, just to orient you to the location. And this here is Burns Point Road. This is an aerial view of the land that was just recently created with the bulkhead. So this area here and the capped area you see with the former dredge. This is a ground shot view under the Jordan Bridge. The EPA remediation project is ongoing. The dredging at the southern branch of the Elizabeth River adjacent to that site is complete. Over 300,000 cubic yards of contaminated sediment have been removed and placed behind the new bulkhead. Capping of the land of the river is complete, as you see in that photo, and the west landfill, which is across from that site, is currently under construction. Work at the PPIC property has just started and is scheduled to be completed by mid-February 2019.
Go back to the last slide, please.
This slide here.
The area under the bridge, that's the new land, the landfill. Can you tell us about the cap? How's it capped?
So they get the dredge from the river bottom. They mix it with Portland cement concrete, let it sit for a while, it stabilizes, and then they place it behind the bulkhead, and then they let that surcharge and settle out. Once it surcharges and settles out and gets to its ultimate whatever that's going to be, they cap it. The cap, I think from the last meeting, is a 12-inch stone cap. On top of that, they also have monitoring wells actually in that in that area, so they can monitor both groundwater and any other types of percolation that may happen, so they can track that, because there's a maintenance plan that comes with this area for whoever the ultimate owner ends up being. Similar to at our PPIC site, they're going to be monitoring wells in place and some other measures so that you can basically see what's happening at that site over time. So if there's any indication that there's a potential failure or issues, you can address those before they get to be too bad.
So the cap is pervious.
It's capped with stone at that depth because of the way stone is. Once it settles out, it's pretty much impervious.
Okay. Bill?
What's the timetable for potential development?
So development for
Anything?
the total project will be complete in 2019. This is currently complete. The PPIC piece down in here, that's 2019, so that's going to take some time for that to settle out before it's available for someone to come in and get on that site. So probably anywhere from a year to 18 months, just to make sure that it's stable. You don't want to start putting a building on and it's still settling. You'll end up with foundation issues. There were 2 items brought up at the PPIC meeting. The first question was EPA asked the city if they had a preference for what type of cap was going to go on the PPIC property, whether they wanted the stone layer or a cap that consists of clay and topsoil, clay being the same as the stone layer, that any water won't be able to penetrate that clay layer. And the second issue was related to this piece right here. It's former state bottom. It's 6 acres, potentially developable, usable land. Right now, the DEQ is assuming ownership, and the state is talking with different folks about disposition of that property. I have one last slide just to show the area of the PPIC piece in here down at Burns Point Road, but that's the gist of my update. Mr. Ashby has to follow, and I'll go back to that piece just for that discussion.
Go back to the top view.
Right there.
Mayor, Vice Mayor, and members of City Council, when EPA was here,
Sturgis.
I want to say Randy Sturgeon was here, it might have been as much as a year ago. There was a bit of a question as to what the disposition of that piece would be, who owned it. At his last appearance, which was about a month ago, a couple of weeks ago to a month ago, he indicated that DEQ was asserting certain rights over that particular piece of area, but there's still a question in terms of, from our perspective, jurisdiction and ownership, both from a zoning and a control regulation standpoint, as well as there's some interesting legal issues about the creation of land in that respect. And so the city is going to begin a discussion with DEQ. I've placed a call into Randy Sturgeon, but I haven't heard back from him, so that we can try to settle some of those issues early on, because that piece of land right now doesn't exist in our records as of this date. So we do have a bit of an issue that we need to resolve pretty quickly.
But is it in fact usable?
Yes.
Yes. Everybody agrees it's usable.
That's
So
clear.
who paid for the development of that extension?
The EPA. EPA picked up a good piece of it. And there's some language about the transitioning of that property early on, but once EPA has done everything it's done and they move off, then it becomes a bit of a question as to who does it belong to, or who has jurisdiction over it.
But it is all located in Portsmouth.
Yes.
It is attached to Portsmouth.
Yeah, okay.
Well, that's located in Portsmouth.
So there,
Well, yeah, I mean, but that's the issue.
Right.
so there was a tax issue about the Jordan Bridge, I believe we discussed one
Correct.
time, as far as where it stopped, as far as what we could tax.
Correct.
So with that land being added on, So where would the taxing issue?
That is the you highlight some of the same issues we had with regard to South Norfolk Jordan Bridge. There were discussions about the and Mr. Wright's going to have to correct me, or Mr. Baldwin, the mean low tide, which is a certain distance away from what you would call the green grass or the land area. There is a bit of law that talks about the middle of the river. And as I mentioned before, somewhere between the middle of the river and the low tide, we have to have that discussion about who's going to control that. Because, and the interesting piece is because that's not naturally occurring. We talk in law school about accretion of land, like the Delta, like New Orleans, and that sort of thing forming over time. That's a bit interesting because it's not naturally occurring, but we need to have that discussion early on and find out to whom it belongs and what jurisdiction we will have with regard to that piece.
So just curious, presently, so where does the tax line stop as far as for the bridge? It doesn't have a tax line. The boundary of the city is defined in two different codes. One is being the middle of the river, and then there's some discussion as it relates to piers and wharves, is taxed to the land it's attached to. So where you see that pier to the left, that's considered Portsmouth because it's jutting out from Portsmouth and it doesn't cross all the way. As I said, this piece becomes a little bit interesting, and in some respects, the boundary for the city is the middle of the river. When we talk about between two adjacent cities, more often than not, you consider the middle of the river to be the boundary.
Let's ask
for jurisdiction purposes.
But how do you tax it?
Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of council, of course, we don't tax the Jordan Bridge anymore under that agreement. But as Mr. Ashby said, the happy place for the line between the two cities seemed to be what we call the pier head line, and that's what Mr. Ashby was referring to out at the end of those piers there. I don't think it was ever really established as fact, but that seemed to be what everybody sort of agreed to at that time. I don't know how that'll work out with this piece of property.
Are there any old survey maps or anything that might define what that boundary is?
We are definitely, that is going to be part of the discussion going forward in terms of presenting all of that, so that we can all come to the same position going forward. Because again, that is not a what I would call a commonly occurring man-made or natural-made event, and so we're going to figure our way out in terms of. But I take the position, much like a pier, it's attached to Portsmouth. It's Portsmouth, and so now we've got to get everybody on the same page.
Well, and I understand what they spoke about, the mean low water. Basically, when you talk about the mean low water, basically anything out in the water is considered state bottom, which is considered owned by the state, and that's how we enforce stuff where I'm employed at. But and understanding that, but I'm curious, since this in theory is man-made and it was dredged, in a way it's similar to Craney Island. And I don't know, the history of that, if that could be used to figure out this, because hopefully it could become the cities at some point.
I take the same position with regard to Craney Island.
We've been talking about that.
Bill?
Well, the boundary out from Craney Island extends out into the river.
Mm-hmm.
I think, if not to the middle of the river,
Right.
I would think that would be the kind of the uniform determination.
And my hope is in a modest amount of time, we'll come back and everyone will be on the same page.
Right.
The warning is already that DEQ is laying claims, because there wasn't, that was swampland marsh at first, and technically we should have been able to lay claim to a certain point out in the water, but the fact that DEQ, I mean, that's just my prediction. If I was a gambling person, they're going to lay claim to that, and we'd have to probably fight for it.
Well, we're going to start with a discussion first, of course. But yes, we have heard the DEQ claim, but that again becomes a little interesting for the reasons already raised. The defined boundary, the mean low tide. Even if you wanted to be generous to them, to DEQ, it's probably not the entire piece.
We don't want to be generous.
And again, you're trying to define what that animal is, because I could argue it's a pier, as opposed to.
Because the controversy over the Jordan Bridge, this is probably going to fit into that argument also, and that's why it's going to probably wind up at the state.
Well, definitely, we're going to have to start that conversation sooner rather than later.
Yes.
Mr. Wright had something he wanted to add.
I just want to say that ownership of land is not DEQ's mission. So DEQ is going to be looking to get rid of it because they're an enforcement agency dealing with environmental issues. So they're not into owning land. So that is not their primary mission or purpose. And so they're going to be looking to get rid of it, whether it's to the city or to someone else. It's not, they don't ultimately want to own that because of just in talking about the PPIC site and the agreement that the city had to go into for, as far as the operations and maintenance of that until that property is sold to a developer. DEQ made it clear that they don't want to own any land. So,
with that in mind, would it pass a Phase 1 environmental assessment if it was sold to another party or given to another party?
I don't know if you necessarily say you pass a Phase 1 environmental assessment. You do the Phase 1 to determine.
But the new owner would be,
what's there. So it'll come with a set of guidelines and criteria, just similar to what you would do in the former Washington Park site for any development. And so it'll come with a list of things you can and can't do and what the site is suitable for.
My point was not necessarily that DEQ was going to be the, take possession, but they are part of the state.
Right.
And the state is the bigger animal.
Yes, sir.
Elizabeth.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Wright, did you, when after Randy gave that presentation at PPIC and for the benefit of the council, the PPIC had a lot of discussion about the question of how to cap off the PPIC property when they're finished in 2019 to make it more presentable and saleable, and what the maintenance would be. So if you grassed it, I'm going to say this wrong. If you put one thing on it, you were going to get weeds and cracks, and it was going to look bad. And if you put another thing on, it was going to require more maintenance. Did we decide?
We have not. I've had conversation with Mr. Moore in Economic Development about each one of the two options, and there's a maintenance plan in place for once EPA is done. The city is going to be responsible for the maintenance no matter what the cap is until it's ultimately sold to the developer.
Can you go to that
what you
slide?
determine, which one?
The slide that shows the PPIC property. That one.
Yeah, that one.
So ultimately, whatever that cap ends up
Show
being
everybody
is
what the
whatever the most marketable piece is. And so Birds Point Road ends approximately here. And so you're talking about, they've moved their production operations onto the site, and that's why it looks like this, as they have capped off this site here. And so you're roughly talking about this area in here and a little bit down into there's some wetlands that you're not allowed to encroach in. So that boundary line is somewhere in here on back, approximately right in here is the area you're talking about for the PPIC property.
Where's the old school bus?
Yeah, so the entire Burton's Point piece, and so so the buildings and trailers are all gone. And so you're talking about from here was that grassy area off to the side where the buses were, the buildings were here, and then you had some area in the back along there that were also where some bus storage was.
Who owns the northern piece?
Here?
Here.
This is
No,
it.
the next piece up.
Here?
Up in the corner, go up.
Where are you at?
Right there, right
Right.
there.
So this continues to be the AWI site. There's some easements in here for the Navy. I think there may also be some City of Portsmouth easements in there for drainage. This is actually the connector that as you come off of the intersection right here at Elm and Victory, you come up here, come around and get onto Burton's Point Road because you can't go down Elm anymore.
Mr. Wright, didn't Mr. I can't think of his name.
Sturgeon.
Sturgeon say that, and if you go back to the bridge, that land, that, the other one where we see the land, that we're going to have to be, whoever, be very careful of what goes on that land because the bridge is right there. That the pilings or whatever for the bridge are right there.
Right. I mean, it's 6 acres, but technically not 6 acres just because there's certain things you can and can't do in the proximity of the bridge, and so you're going to be limited by the bridge cutting through
So
that
the
piece of
pilings
property.
go straight and divide those two pieces.
So whoever gets that piece of property ultimately is going to have to be cognizant of there's certain things, like I said, they can and can't do within the proximity of the bridge for the safety of the bridge and actually for their own safety as well.
Questions? None?
Did I answer your question about the cap? Or okay.
Yeah, we haven't decided yet.
Right. Yes, ma'am.
That's an answer.
So the whole project's going to be done and completed by 2019?
February 2019 is their anticipated completion date.
But it'll probably be another year or so before we can get rid of that property, or it'll be marketable.
You can start marketing, just you don't want to build on it.
All right.
Thank you, Mr. Wright.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Baldwin will come forward with the zoning ordinance update in preparation for this Thursday's meeting.
Good evening, Mayor Rowe, Vice Mayor Simmons, members of council. I'm really going to be just giving you a preview for Thursday, so I'm not going to go really in depth into a lot of what we're going to be talking about. But as you're aware, on Thursday, the City Council and the Planning Commission will be conducting a joint work session, one of several that have been scheduled to work through the zoning ordinance. At some discussion in prior meetings with City Council, a couple of the issues you indicated you wanted to spend more time in was looking at the philosophy or philosophies that are used to build a zoning ordinance. And I think you're probably aware, unlike many other laws and regulations you have in place, the zoning ordinance really has multiple purposes. One of those being to implement comprehensive plan recommendations. So your zoning is trying to help you accomplish the land use plan you've adopted as part of a comprehensive plan. And the other thing it does, it has a lot of effect on how you approach development, how you approach neighborhood preservation, conservation, protection, transportation. There's just a whole series of things. And so generally speaking, and a lot of people don't think of it that way, but if you look at the zoning ordinance, I'm going to take a minute and talk a little about our 2010 process. There's a fair amount of philosophy. One of the reasons you sense so much difference from the prior zoning ordinance to the new ordinance was the implementation of some philosophies into the zoning ordinance trying to accomplish certain things. Some of those things you haven't liked, and I'm going to speak about one of the first things you have. Now, we provided you, as was mentioned, you've got a workbook. We're going to give you an updated version tomorrow. We've made some modifications. I want to mention that workbook is a portion of a larger version we have that's on the Planning Department webpage. That one has a number of maps. If you want to go look at that one, for example, we've broken down zoning maps. Way too much for us to have you upload into your tablet for ease of looking at, because it's about 73 pages of background materials. Not that you necessarily need all of it. We tried to create a document in there if somebody actually wanted to go back and look at where the GMU properties are located or where the IL properties are located. There's a series of zoning maps that break the zoning ordinance into pieces, so you don't have to look at the big map and see all those different colors. We've tried to segment it, so it's just for a reference if anybody wants to go look at that. The second one is, obviously, we have a smaller version, really getting to the two pieces that City Council want to get into, the philosophy piece, and then the 19 pages of the land use tables that you're going to want to go through. So I'm going to take a moment. Again, we're going to give you an updated version, but your workbook and your looks like this. It's the current version now is actually a little over 50 pages. Again, you don't have to go through all 50 pages, but keep in mind 19 pages of that is your land use table. So the first thing we'll talk about Thursday night, and again at council's discussion, is the zoning philosophies. And you look in your workbook. We've provided, this is the staff extraction of what we think the philosophies are that are built into the 2010 ordinance. And in this table you'll look at, we've done 2 columns. One of them is where we've attempted to identify what we consider some of the major philosophies that are in the code. The second one, which will be an issue for you as we go forward with the rest of the project, is how did that get executed? So how did that philosophy get translated into regulation? So when you said, this is what I want the code to be, for example, I want to be developer friendly. That's what we wanted to be. What did the city do to try to accomplish that? And then you can determine whether or not that was a successful execution. Some cases you may want to execute whoever put some of these ideas together, but the idea being that some of these are, so for example, I'll just give you a quick run, like on the developer friendly, and this did happen with the code, we have more by right uses and fewer use permit uses than in the prior code, so that was done. However, in doing that, the determination was made, the developers would prefer if you gave them a real clear picture of what all of your standards are going to be. So we're going to be very prescriptive in our standards, of which that did not work out so well. That became more of a roadblock. So on the one hand, trying to be developer friendly, you created a code that turned out to be, a little bit more restrictive than you might have had in mind. So that's in there. We've just given, this is really a starting point for conversation. We put a few in there. There was a determination that we wanted to raise the bar on the quality of development. That, of course, came out of the comprehensive plan. We want to be more design-based as opposed to use-based, and that brought you your form-based code that you like so much in the D2. It also brought you the D1 Smart Code District. Those were both design-based, and that was a change to try to focus more on how things looked and less on the specifics of the uses. And that, again, that was a philosophy of the code. And it was also going to be more bike and pedestrian friendly, and quite frankly, that turned into be a little bit more auto hostile in many ways. And so you ran into some issues with parking requirements and some of those things. So just want you to keep in mind as you go forward, there's a philosophy, and then the regulatory execution, getting the regulations to do what your philosophy is describing. So that's part one of the discussion for Thursday. The second thing, as we mentioned, you've got 19 pages of the use table. We've provided this to you actually at least one other prior occasion that's out there. It's also in the zoning ordinance online. Just to quickly orient you, I know it looks like a lot of stuff on there. Really, there's just a couple things you need to look at across the top. You see the abbreviations for the different zoning districts. Along the side, you see the different land uses. And so you basically match up the land use. You can look across the different zoning districts and see how that use is treated. What we provided in your workbook for to be helpful to you if you want to refer to it, for each zoning district, we provided a definition, like what is the GMU district supposed to be? What is the light industrial district? So we've provided you a definition, so you'll, what do they mean when they have these, high density urban residential, whatever the different, terminology zoning district come across. So those are defined in there for you. We've also given you the definition of the definition section of the zoning code, where most of these uses are defined. If you look down and go, what do you define as a single family house, or what do you define as a veterinary office, or what do you define as whatever. And that's why the book ends up so long. It's mostly just definitions. So if you don't need to refer to the definitions, you don't need to look at all those pages. But if you want to look at the definitions, some of the terminology, it's zoning language, which we're going to try to get away from as we update the code. Some of these you may want to look back at the definition and go, well, what exactly is that use that's defined in there? So that's the two primary things we'll be working through on Thursday night. Our assumption is we go through this thing, you're probably going to walk through the use table page by page. We'll be giving you a hard copy for Thursday when you come in, so we can.
Bill's got a question, Bill.
In talking about land use, I know the use goes with the land.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any circumstances where it can go with the use instead of the land?
The way the zoning is set up, the zoning districts are applied to the parcel of property. The one place is there can be some limitations in that. For example, if the General Assembly doesn't keep changing it every year. There are places where you come in time restrictions. For example, you might grant a use permit, and if someone doesn't activate that use permit can in fact become null and void over time. You do have issues related to nonconformities, which we'll have as a future work session topic, where you have uses that are on the land, but they're not protected forever. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Well, probably a hypothetical thing. Let's say that we granted a use permit for a business, and that business ended up having some problems with the community. Well, since that use went with the land, somebody else could come along and operate the same type of business. So I guess what I'm saying is, does our code allow any flexibility on granting the use? Is it always got to be the land, or can it be the?
It can't be the applicant. It can't be the user.
It can't be.
It can't be.
Well, it can't be.
No, you cannot attach it to the user. For example,
That's prohibited by.
that's prohibited by code.
But can it be the use?
Use.
Well, I'm a little unclear how you would apply that. If you had a piece of property, we'll just go through the process. If you have a piece of property and it's zoned for commercial use, and so somebody comes in and opens up a restaurant on it, and we go through our normal code. So then say, I'm going to have live entertainment. That triggers an entertainment use permit. Okay, that's our current code. That use permit part, the entertainment use permit, is regulated through the use permit process by city council, and that's revocable, the use permit part of it.
Right.
The underlying use of permitted by right use is not revocable. And I think that's something to keep in mind when you look at the use table. A by right use.
There's your comfort right there.
Yeah.
I mean, if it goes haywire, you can revoke it.
Right, and you've had an example, the old, the mansion. It's the one time I'm aware of the city revoked a use permit.
Right.
That one was revoked. And the reason that was revoked, because if you hadn't revoked it, someone could have come behind it and said, hey, I've got a use permit here. I'm going to go in and reopen. So the reason that we went through the process of revocation was to prohibit anyone from coming in and using that old use permit.
But you can't revoke the.
If it's a by right use, and that's again, when you go the route of saying it's going to be a by right use, now I will say this: if the use is not established, so you have vacant parcels out there, or somebody's going to demolish and rebuild, you can modify your zoning ordinance and make that use become non-conforming. And we'll have a session on non-conformities in November. Now, under non-conformities, vacant uses can be made to go away.
Was that enacted by the General Assembly that you cannot assign the use to the applicant? Or
And
was
that's
it
illegal. That's been
adjudicated?
legally established. That the land use regulations, and this is national, not just in Virginia. The land use, your authority to control land is with the land, not with the applicant. I mentioned the story to people. I'm probably one of the few people that actually worked with Van Lefko when he was on the Planning Commission here back in the 80s. And if you look back in the Planning Commission votes in the 1980s, you'll see a lot of 6-1 votes from the Planning Commission with Mr. Lefko voting no. Back in those days, we used to attach a condition to attach the use permit to the owner, to the applicant, against all sorts of advice that wasn't legal. He voted against all of those until the city modified its code to be in compliance with the law.
Actually, that was still being practiced when I came on council.
It is not an uncommon practice. I'll tell you just a brief little. When I worked in Suffolk, there was a piece of property at the foot of the Nansemond River Bridge. A guy came in and opened up a fish, a bait and tackle shop, Randy's Rods, for those people around there at the time. The zoning for that property went to Randy of Randy's bait and tackle. And when Randy passed away, we basically said, we've got no zoning. The applicant, the owner, the condition attached to someone who's deceased. And that's a prime example why you don't want the use, because when the next guy shows up, we're like, I don't know what to tell you. Only Randy can use the property, and unfortunately, he passed away. So they had to go through a rezoning process. I will tell you one other thing that's interesting in all this, proffers. As you know, we do a lot of conditional zoning. We've obviously been doing some less with the way the General Assembly's been going. Proffers go with the land. So even if you change the zoning, unless the owner agrees to modify the proffers stay. So if I came in and put in proffers to build a residential development, and then I sold my property to somebody else, and then nothing happened, and the city comes in and goes, well, I think that property ought to be industrial, and the owner disagrees, and the city exercises its authority to rezone the property, you still have those proffers in place.
And the General Assembly has made it more difficult to talk with the developer about proffers?
On residential projects in particular, absolutely. And so we will be discussing in future work sessions with council some alternatives to using conditional zoning and proffers, which we think we can get the same kind of quality result without getting tangled up in the proffer regulations from the state until the General Assembly eventually changes that. And if they don't change that, we do need an alternate. And we'll basically, in that case, be talking about using more overlay districts, similar to what we described with the D2.
You would think that proffers would be the one thing that wouldn't go with the...
Yeah, they go with the land. I'll just give another example. Newport News had a property out there where Inview Plantation is out there that at one time had been approved for a conditional zoned residential development. And the city took it over they wanted to build a shopping mall out there, and they went forward with it, and all those proffers are still in place, including all these, ones that were clearly for residential purposes, dealing with driveways and curb cuts, and clearly not a shopping center. And it took them a while to figure out they had to go back and get the ownership out of the city's hands into like their economic development authority, so they could come back in and remove all the proffers, even though the city had purchased the property. They could not unilaterally just ignore the proffered conditions because they just kept getting transferred with the property until an owner agreed to remove the proffers. So that's just a unique twist to conditional zoning.
So, so if this is something that's at the state level with the General Assembly, is this something that we can consider in our legislative packet, or?
We've tried, and I can tell you that I believe the year before last, I went and spoke before the General Assembly, one of their committees on that, and I think they're now starting to get enough. Again, most of them deal with cash proffers in Northern Virginia, but they're starting to get some pushback up there because a lot of localities have just refused to rezone. And so the developers, instead of having, and granted, I understand their concern, some of those proffers are getting up in the $40,000, $50,000 per unit range up in Northern Virginia. But when the locality stopped rezoning, that's not exactly what the development community had in mind. So I think we're heading to a point in which the General Assembly is going to be taking a look at modifying. We've tried to get them to address the use of proffers when it's not a cash proffer, the way we would typically use it.
Right.
And another piece of that that's just happened recently, where a developer was denied and he sued us, and he's still in the process. That's still going. And then because of what the General Assembly allowed, because of the hardship periods so they go back and use that to submit another proposal while this lawsuit is still, being heard, and they were allowed to do that. Fortunately, they try to say, well, they were going to use the same plans and the same type of construction that was used. And fortunately, the city, our planning department, showed them that it really wasn't the same, but I just don't understand how they can sue us, the same developer, and he turn around and try to submit another plan, and we have to consider it.
Well, one of the things the General Assembly's been doing, and this started during the recession, but almost on any permit that gets approved that has a time frame attached to it, they've been extending it every General Assembly session. So when we used to have 2 years, like it used to be, a use permit was valid for 2 years. You might have a site plan was valid for 5. The General Assembly just keeps saying, if you had a plan approved by such and such a date, it's still valid. So we've got some plans that have been, around in the office, 6, 7, 8, 9 years that are still valid because of the General Assembly action, not by what normally would have been an expiration.
But a post-recession approval that has a time certain deadline is okay?
Well, we still can attach those, but if they go back in and they just keep changing that date. So it says anything approved since such and such a date, we're going to extend it another year. So, yeah, we still are in the practice of a 2-year, 5-year, hoping that at some point the General Assembly will stop doing that. Because, as you know, 5 years, a lot can change. So we have a lot of issues again too in terms of vested rights and the regulations that were in place at the time, especially when they get 7, 8, 9 years of age on them. But that was a recession era code change, and the General Assembly, for whatever reason, has decided to keep extending it. Maybe they'll stop this session.
We don't want to get you off track, but this is a good discussion. Council received a online submittal about a property owner whose house straddles 3 lots, and because of that cannot add on unless the lot lines are vacated, which creates a hardship. Can you tell us what the remedy is there? And is this something we need to discuss with the Planning Commission?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and that's under our non-conforming topic. We, with the 2010 ordinance, the city took a broad view of non-conformities, and they've created a number of issues. And this code section that applies here, on the surface, sounds like it makes normal sense. So I'll give you an example. If you're in Parkview, and if you look at the original way that the neighborhood was platted in Parkview, they were platted in 25-foot lots. And then property owners or builders would come in and go, I need 2 lots, I need 3 lots. Depending on the size of the structure, they would put the house in. So you'd have 3 lots and a house on. I'm sure you're very familiar with these in the assessor's office. So we have all over the city, older lots in particular, pre-zoning lots in particular. Well, there's smaller lots that were assembled and you put a house on it sitting on 2 or 3 lots. Now, under normal zoning, each one of those lots is not large enough to stand on its own. So those are non-conforming lots. And what the code currently says is if you have multiple lots that are at your house and you come in to do something with your house, build an addition, whatever, before we issue a permit, we require you to go back and vacate those internal lot lines to put the lot back in place. Now, I can tell you from conversations, this has been on the planning department's list as we started this project. We consider this a real hindrance to people being able to upgrade their properties. It's fairly expensive. For example, somebody wants to put a small addition on it, it can cost them $1,500 to $2,000 in addition just to vacate the lot lines. We believe we've got some ways to address that definition-wise. It would not make you physically have to go through the process of vacating, similar to the way we treat parcels owned right now by the same owner. And we have some language in there to call that a zone lot. In any event, yes, I think, for us to get away from that, though, the current ordinance would need to be amended. So if you want to discuss that, and I mentioned the one you're describing, yes, it's three parcels. And this has actually got a couple of interesting twists to it, but it's 3 parcels. House has been sitting there since the 30s, I believe. They want to take out the rear of the house and do an addition. And so the requirement would be before you do that, you got to come back through and vacate these lot lines. So in addition to it being costly, it's time consuming. That's probably a 60-day delay while they get a surveyor, prepares all the plats, and we do the review and all of those things. So in that case, the remedy for that is a code amendment where we treat those lots differently than a traditional sort of a non-conforming lot that just doesn't meet a lot requirement.
Is there a sentiment on council to do yet another
Blow up.
Another patch?
Yes.
This would not be a patch. This will be a fix. This will not be a patch.
I'm starting to say fix first.
This is a fix. We would not go back and patch this one. This is an error in our judgment in terms of Portsmouth. It may work in other localities.
How long would that fix take?
Normal process, and we have the holidays come up. We have to take a look at council's schedule to get on what it would take. We need to be authorized to do that. So we need a resolution from City Council to tell the staff you can initiate the code change, or a motion from the Planning Commission to initiate the code change, at which time staff is then authorized to fix that as a separate task. Depending on when that happens, we'd be looking at probably getting to the Planning Commission with that in as potentially early as November, and the council in December.
Does the state code prescribe that it has to be a resolution from council?
Yes.
It can't be a motion,
That's
but
correct.
it can be a motion.
It's a motion from the Planning Commission.
Do you know the sentiment of the Planning Commission?
We have not discussed that with the Planning Commission.
Discuss it Thursday.
Yes.
We can bring it up
Yeah.
Thursday.
And
Do we have a consensus amongst ourselves that this is an issue that needs to be fixed?
Yes.
And I will say that we do have a Planning Commission meeting scheduled in October. We can get them at that open meeting, their regular meeting, to pass the motion for us to do the work. And we'll put that on for a November Planning Commission public hearing.
Would it speed it up if they took a vote on Thursday? No? Okay.
I think we did that. October's technically beyond our normal date, but we'll accelerate because we know what the sentiment of council is. So we'll go ahead and start. We've already started doing some of the work on it because we identified this ourselves before we got into the rewrite process. This is just happening too often.
Dr. Patton, before you speak, can you get word back to the person that brought this to our attention?
Yes,
This is the plan?
We will get word back to tomorrow. Mr. Baldwin and I have talked about this several times, and I said to him that this is not the normal situation, and as fast as we can move it forward for the family and that family member that is in need of new access into the house, we want to do everything we can do to accelerate to get it done as quick as possible.
And
So
if I could take one moment.
Hold on a minute.
Okay.
With this resolution, we can bring that forward at our next meeting, which would be the 9th.
It sounds like the planning commission.
We'll go to the planning commission the 2nd.
The 2nd.
Yeah, and then we'll bring back to council your first meeting in December.
Whatever it takes to fast track, whoever. can-
We'll take a look at that schedule.
Yeah.
All right.
I was just going to mention, this actually is an application that's got another twist to it you might be interested in. General Assembly in the 2018 session. As you know, we do have a process in the zoning ordinance for granting variances. And the way the variances are described, it's a hardship that goes with the land. And this is very along the lines of Councilman Moody's sort of inquiry. And in that, they basically say you're supposed to look for a hardship that's approaching confiscation. Not quite as stringent today as it used to be, but basically there's got to be something with the property. They've just in the 2018 session put in some language that for persons with disabilities or people dealing with the ADA, that's also now grounds for variance, which we've never had. We've had a number of property owners have come through with people that need modifications for, whether it be for ramps or access doors or modifying garages that need to do that because of issues related to being able to get in and out of their property with wheelchairs or what have you. And when the zoning ordinance doesn't allow it, you normally go to the variance route. Of course, the variance doesn't speak to the person, it speaks to the property till now. So there is a provision there now. People can come in if they have an issue related to handicap or disability status or ADA compliance. They can use that as grounds for requesting a modification. The interesting thing about that one, which we just started talking about, is it actually has a provision that if the person who required the modification then at some point leaves the facility, that's a variance can actually be terminated once the need for the disabled person has been eliminated. It's kind of an interesting. I'm not sure how that would work, but that's in the language. But that's an alternative. In this one case you're mentioning, that would actually be another alternative to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals and request a variance, which we can also advise them as well. So we'll pass that on. Something interesting, we've had that issue come up a number of times. I don't know if you've ever been inquire about for based on disability status needing some sort of a modification. So if I could just finish. We'll get back on my point here. So again, so Thursday night we're going to go through that process. We're going to discuss philosophy. Again, I think you can see there's a number of issues related to the execution part of it. What happens long term if you go from less use permits to more by right, and what does that mean? How you use permits, those types of things. And then so we'll walk through that at whatever pace you want to walk through that. I just want to make sure you're clear on how the use table's set up. There's 3 things to look for. If you look in the block and it's blank, or you see a slash in it, that means that's not permitted. If you think of a use that you don't see listed, that's not allowed. So if somebody came in and said, I want to do this use, and we can't find it in the code and we can't describe it in the code, the law states, and that use is simply not allowed unless City Council were to modify the use table. So a couple of things just for your background. The rest you'll see things with a U, that's the use permit, things with a P, that's permitted by right. You're going to see a few things in there with the letter A, ignore those. Those are going away with the new code, so you're not going to need those are related to some zoning districts that tied back to the old comp plan, and they're going to have to be eliminated. So don't waste your time in the A's.
Can you give us an update on what the schedule is? What's our goal to finish this?
Well, we're still working through at council's pace, things we're working on. We are planning to come back in November, depending on what happens with your discussion on Thursday. The next we have a few big items we need to get through. The next big items we want to get through in November, we're going to discuss performance standards. Those are the regulations. I mentioned the prescriptive standards. Depending on how you want to approach some of those things, that's a very important conversation. We'll also discuss this issue of nonconformities. That's another issue we've got that really needs to be dealt with. Once we get through those things, we're ready then to get back into the process of drafting, of doing code language drafting. Once we get clear guidance on those things, between the use table, performance standards, nonconformities. So Once we get through November, I have a better idea how much longer that would take. We also need to finish up the D2 overlay district we've discussed before, and some tweaks we need to do to the D1. But I'm going to assume that once we clear November, we're probably 6 months out, maybe something like that, to get to the end. I'd say maybe 12 months from where we're standing to get into public hearing. That's our goal. Obviously, we're going to take whatever time council wants to spend on it to make sure we get this as right as we can get it at this point. And we have to fix some of those patches we've done with permanent modifications.
Okay.
Questions of Bob?
We'll probably talk about this use table tomorrow, but, I mean, all of them seem like good categories, but the special district, I mean, is that a free-for-all, or is this, I mean...
Right, and so, I'm glad you bring that up. So, just for background, you know, what we used to have before the D1 and D2 were created, the D1 is smart code. And if you look at the people who invented the smart code, they use those transects. So you see the T6, T5, T4, T3. We stop at a T3. And then they have another category for things that aren't really into that density thing, which the Ts are intended to be levels of intensity of development. And then you have the SD, which is a special district. In this case, it was the old Port Center Commerce Park. In the former zoning code, the Port Center Commerce Park had its own zoning designation. We had a number of places that had either a planned office park designation or a planned business park. So this one got its own definition as a special district. It's in essence a light industrial or a flex space, and that's some of the staff. I will mention this after you give us some feedback at the meeting on Thursday. You know, staff has not weighed in with some of our suggestions of recommended fixes. That SD district, that's part of our D1, is going to need to be retrofitted either with its own designation, or we're going to have to see if it can be applied with an existing. We're trying not to create too many one-off districts, but that's a great question because we haven't resolved all of that. One of the things that happened, they took beyond the Port Center Commerce Park and actually took some other property in, which makes the zoning piece a little bit more complicated for us to fix. But we will get to that as part of the D1 fix, and that'll be a separate conversation.
I think we're good, Mayor. I think we're good.
Just, if you have a cell phone, please put it on vibrate. Any questions of Mr. Baldwin?
If you have any questions in the meantime before Thursday, any questions you have about information we give you, like I mentioned, there's that longer version of the document that's on our the Planning Department webpage. It's listed under special projects, and there's a zoning ordinance piece in there, and that's sitting in there. Like I said, it's about 73 pages, but that's some maps and things. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mayor. Mayor, members of council, this concludes our presentations. I will now go over the city manager's report.
Ray Scott.
Can I ask the question just for me? And I know I'm not going to be around too much longer, but I noticed the panel reads all of these things that's coming up on the agenda. Is that something that she wants to do? Is that something y'all require, or is that?
She wants to do.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to know. Thank you.
Right, I'm just, Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of City Council, you have 8 items on the city manager's report. The first is the 2019 Victim Witness Grant and its adoption of an ordinance accepting $532,761 from the Virginia Department of Criminal Justice Services, and you will be appropriating the said to the FY 2019 Grants Fund for the use by the Commonwealth Attorney's Office for the Victim Witness Program. Currently, the Victim Witness Program in the city of Portsmouth sees about 1,400 victims annually. And so with this particular grant, they will be bringing on an additional staff person that's a part of the grant program. The next item is a Community Criminal Justice Board membership and its adoption of an ordinance to amend a section of the criminal justice membership of Chapter 2 of the Code of the City of Portsmouth, Virginia, 2006, as amended to expand the Community Criminal Justice Board by designating 4 new members, and this is requested by the board. And those new members will be the Chief of Adult Probation, the Director of Juvenile Court Services, the Director of Community Corrections, and the Director of Social Services. The next item is a selective enforcement alcohol grant and the adoption of an ordinance accepting a grant in the amount of $33,511 from the U.S. Department of Transportation National Highway Traffic Safety Administration through the Virginia Department Safety Office and appropriating the said in the 2019 grant fund. And this will be used for the city's police department to deter driving under the influence of alcohol. The next is a selective enforcement speeding DMV FY 2019 grant and its adoption of an ordinance accepting the grant of $21,576 from the U.S. Department of Transportation National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. This money will be going into the 2019 grants fund for use by the police department to deter speeding. The next is a memorandum agreement with the Hampton Roads Sanitation District, which is a carryover from our last meeting, and it's an adoption of a resolution authorizing the city manager to execute an amendment to that certain memorandum of agreement dated March 10th, 2014 with the Hampton Roads Sanitation District and 12 other localities regarding wet weather sanitary sewer overflows. Those are the items that will be coming forward to you this evening. I'd also like to...
While we're on the agenda, let's go over a couple of things. We've got 3 public hearings, and 2 of them, the applicant's the city. The first one, the applicant's a private party. So keeping with our policy, before opening the public hearing, I'll ask the applicant to come forward, and the applicant will have 10 minutes to explain the application. And then I'll ask Dr. Patton if she has any comments, and that will be an opportunity for you to call the director. And then we'll open the public hearing. So I just want to make sure. And then for the city, the applicant, I'll call upon you, Dr. Patton. You can introduce the
consultant.
Yeah,
Right.
10 minutes, though, for us, too. And then we have a resolution that pertains to the emergency declaration that needs to come up under items submitted by council. So and we'll need a motion on that. And right before 5 o'clock, Deborah told me that the gremlins have gotten into our electronic voting system. So tonight, all of our votes will be roll call, and the request to speak button is not working. So please raise your hand or call me by name, and I'll recognize you.
We have any jelly beans?
What's the issue?
Are you gonna sit on something a little taller so we can see you?
Yes, sir. Some telephone books. And so after we do the electronic call vote, I'll ask Deborah to announce the vote so that everybody knows what the vote is. Any other things we need to talk about, the logistics of the meeting? We have a presentation on Manufacturing Day that it's a proclamation that declares a day as Manufacturing Day. All righty.
Don't we have the Boy Scouts?
I didn't know.
Do we have Boy Scouts?
Did I read the Boy Scouts are coming for the...
They may be on there to do the pledge.
Okay.
Oh, are they?
Are they up
Yeah,
there?
yes.
Yeah,
Not on my copy. But
yeah. Boy Scout troop, it's not.
As soon as
It's Boy Scout troops 210 and 256.
Might have been a late add-on.
okay. Boy Scout who?
210 and 256.
56.
I don't have it either.
You can speak to this.
With
Thank
Pastor
you.
Yancey, you have him.
I got
Okay.
him. All right, Dr. Patton.
Mayor, when we look at City Council report backs, you have received in your box a couple of weeks now the 2019 legislative initiative, and we asked if you had any comments or anything as it relates to the state and federal initiatives. The item of which was requested by Dr. Whitaker, of which was on the last sheet of your page. Mr. Ashby will speak to it.
Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of City Council, Ms. Sherry Neal did identify a number of congressional bills that address the no cash bail process. So there are several outstanding federal bills that address that issue in one level or another. I know Dr. Whitaker raised that issue, and we just need to know what the consensus of council is with regard to that particular matter.
All right. When would you like our feedback?
But we'd like it before the end of the week.
End of the week.
Okay. All right. The next item was the city attorney met with the judges on the law library board, and he'd like to report back on that.
Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of City Council, since we last met, I have had the meeting with the judges with regard to the Law Library Board. I also met this week with the Portsmouth Bar at their regular meeting and luncheon. And so we have had the initial discussion with regard to the Law Library Board. The Circuit Court judges are very excited and interested in terms of getting together and programming those funds. And I also made the pitch to have members of the bar file applications with Ms. Deborah White so that we can get that reconstituted quickly.
All right, the next item was the Towing Advisory Board. The request was how many compound areas are located within the outside of Portsmouth, and staff to provide lists of Portsmouth towing companies. The city clerk has sent a boards and commission package to each of those companies that are listed on the towing list, and that has gone out, if you want to speak to it.
Members of City Council, we mailed out the packages to all of the tow companies. A part of your boards and commissions information you're considering today, you'll see that we're already receiving responses. We're not yet ready for you to do that appointment. We want to give everyone a chance to decide whether they're going to do it or not. We did give them a date of October the 16th. To let us know, and that way, hopefully by your second meeting, we'll have everything together and be ready for you to make an appointment.
Okay. The last item, Mayor and members of City Council, I'd like to call to your attention as it relates to responsiveness of emergency 911. And I want you to know that we're looking into the inquiries related to E911 with both police, fire, human resources, and our information technology. We've had several meetings to ascertain how to more effectively address the calls that are made by our citizens for both emergency assistance and information. Human Services Management is taking the lead in developing an accelerated staffing plan for the 911 center, which includes pre-employment testing and reducing the period from application to the hiring date, the period of time. The city is in the process of exploring the hiring of call takers and additional E911 dispatchers. Also, the Chief Information Officer has studied the call volumes and the difference between the 911 emergency and the non-emergency calls, resulting in the prioritization of emergency calls and exploring the 311 information platform that will reduce the volumes of calls to the E911 number. Right now, the calls are being funneled in, even if they are the emergency, or if they're non-emergency, they are still being funded in through the E911. Cities across the region back in 2009, as we looked and researched, implemented the 311, which is a number that the citizens would call and be able to get information. In talking with the citizen today, which I shared with you that I had talked with the citizen, and I shared with her we're looking into having the emergency number, but the 311, and she said, well, what I called in for really was some loud music. It wasn't an emergency that the police, needed to come right away, but I was going to share that this music was distracting. if you had a 311 and there are people to answer it, then that would have been able to not top the 911 because it wasn't an emergency, anybody was hurt. So we will launch a broad campaign as we are exploring, and we would be working, Mr. Jones is working through the system to see how all the telephone would be set up for a 311 line, to introduce the public to how the 311 number will provide up-to-date information and answer routine questions which are now coming into the 911 for information. And the chief is here. I asked her to be here because the dispatchers share that they're getting calls, but they're answering every call that comes in. But 400 and something on one day were not emergency calls. They were what is the show at Antelos tonight, or questions that they're just that everything goes into this call circuit. So Chief, if you wanted to make a few comments. Everything goes into the same system.
Mr. Mayor, Vice Mayor Simmons, members of City Council, we have been working diligently, especially with City HR, trying to increase our staffing within the 911 center. But in the meantime, we have several individual officers that are on long-term administrative duty, and I have moved all of them. It's 6 of them as of today. I moved them to the 911 center. They are currently being trained as call takers. And it's not as simple as just answering the phone, because they have to be able to answer the phone and input the data into the computer system so the calls can be dispatched or sent over to a dispatcher as well. We are working with the resources we have until we can get new employees on board so we can answer the calls that are coming in, and especially until we get a new 311 center where information can go.
Thank you. Any questions for the chief? Thank you, ma'am.
All right, thank you.
Dr. Patton, any more?
That concludes the presentation.
Bring it back. Yeah.
You said you wanted to know from each of us whether to include this addendum to the legislative package?
No.
I mean,
The issue about no cash bail is
right.
the
I know
question.
that. That's what I'm asking.
Yes, sir.
He wanted a consensus from us, right?
Well, no.
Not today, but
Not today. They want to,
Correct.
on all the total package, he was just pointing out that they found the legislation that was asked about.
Oh, okay. I thought I heard you say that y'all wanted a consensus for us to include that in our package.
That's what we're going to just give our feedback to Dr. Patton by Friday.
Right. And I'm giving mine today. No.
So,
You hear that, Dr. Patton?
Yes, sir, here.
I thought we were, Dr. Patton, when can we expect an update on the end of the year stipend for our retirees?
Right, what we, as I said, Mr. Moody, in working with Mrs. Spivey, when you gave me a time, we've got about a couple of weeks before we can look at what is the report that's coming in.
The cap, we will cover
The year end.
prepared for the end of October. It won't be finalized, but they'll be prepared enough that we will know our fund balance.
Right.
So last meeting and...
No, we'll come back to you to share what I said in my budget message was that we were not giving any increase to city employees during the current budget. I would look at before the end of the year to come back and see if there is an opportunity for us to provide some kind of bonus or something, and that's in my budget message.
So we can expect that to hear...
We would look to have that sometime in as we have done, when we've done bonuses, that would come sometimes in December.
Bonus would come in December, but when would we see the data on the end of the year to know what the size and whether
She said that
we're
would
gonna
come
do it?
the end of October. That report should be finished by the end of October. and then I will come forward and let council know exactly how we're looking and what we can or cannot do.
Would you want to go ahead and schedule it for the first meeting in November on work session?
Yes, I think that would be good.
Yeah, when we get the
Get it on
report,
the
we're gonna bring
docket.
it back. Yeah, we will.
All right, liaison reports, Dr. Whitaker. Nate.
I don't have any.
Elizabeth.
Yes, I do. URHA had their annual meeting on Thursday, September 20th. And of course, everyone knows now the new chair is Davy Smith. And the new vice chair is Sonia Chapman, who is the resident commissioner. They talked about some things with their budget. They're trying to cut their budget by reducing some staff and also the central cost center. They've cut their employees from 114 down to 82. They want to bring up, I know that we're going to be meeting with them in October. One of the things that they want to bring up, the conversation was Swanson Homes, and in light of the last hurricane that we had with the frenzy of if there will be a flood. And of course, to date, they have sunk $3.2 million into renovating Swanson Homes with the last flood, Matthew. And of course, if another flood or hurricane were to occur, they wouldn't want to sink any additional money into that. So they want to bring up at our meeting, if we could put it on the agenda for Swanson Homes, what is the city's plan? They know that we're doing Crawford revitalization, but what do we have going into that area, into Swanson Homes? It was a lot of discussion between the board members if they want to demolish it now or, but sinking $3.2 million was not a smart move, especially when they're trying to recoup the money back from the insurance company and FEMA. So they wanted to bring it up. They want it to be a part of the agenda item that we discuss with them. What are our plans for Swanson Home? Because eventually, 5-10 years down the line, they want to look at, what's going to be their option with that. And of course, I brought up the concern about the property at Seaboard Square. They do have a developer on board who is they're looking to close on that soon. And the last issue is, of course, our Effingham property where the developer, Buddha Group, was looking to get tax credits and were not successful with that. They're going to go in and try again. And if that's not successful, they want to look at giving that back to the city.
Yeah, they're not going to get tax credit.
So that the one thing is that they want to put on the agenda is the discussion about Swanson Home.
Right, usually, Mayor, if I may, usually the executive director, Mr. Bland, will come forward when we meet and we have a meeting with the items that his commission wants to have on there, and then we'll see what council would want to have on there, and we'll set the agenda together.
Right.
So he'll come forward with those.
Ray, did you?
That's the new apartments at County and Effingham.
Yes.
Okay.
Anything? Ray, anything?
No.
We do have a need for a closed session. Is there a motion?
Move to go into closed meeting pursuant to Virginia Code subsection 2.2-3711A1 for the discussion of assignment, appointment, or salaries of city council appointees, and pursuant to Virginia Code section 2.2-3711A1 for the purpose of discussing and considering prospective candidates for and appointees to boards and commissions, and pursuant to Virginia Code subsection 2.2-3711A7 for the purpose of consultation with legal counsel pertaining to actual or probable litigation, where such consultation in open meeting would adversely affect the negotiating or litigating posture of the city, specifically regarding Virginia International Gateway Incorporated versus the City of Portsmouth, Virginia, Portsmouth Circuit Court case number CL 16001427-00, and Virginia International Gateway Incorporated versus the City of Portsmouth, Virginia, Portsmouth Circuit Court case number CL 15002813-00.
Is there a second? Second. Any discussion? Madam Clerk, would you call the roll, please?
Yes, sir. Mr. Clark?
Yes.
Mrs. Lucasberg?
Yes.
Mr. Moody?
Yes.
Ms. Simmons?
Yes.
Mr. Smith?
Yes.
Dr. Whitaker?
Yes.
Mayor Rowe?
Yes, we're in closed session.
Okay.